Let us begin our long, slow journey into the deep time of Jerusalem, a city so ancient that its beginnings are lost in the quiet murmur of the stones themselves. We drift back, past the noise of history, past the great empires, to a time when it was merely a fortified hill in the dusty terrain of Canaan. Imagine the landscape not as a bustling metropolis, but as a rugged Kiat Platea surrounded by the deep, winding valleys of the Cradle. The first breath of life this place drew was due to a single, profound gift of nature, the Gihon Spring. The Gihon was a natural, intermittent spring that flowed from a cave in the Kidron Valley, a reliable source of fresh, cool water in an arid land. It was this water, this quiet, essential flow, that determined the city's very placement. A city can only exist where water allows it to, and so, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, the first quiet settlements began to cling to the steep, narrow ridge above the spring, a location later known as the City of David. These were the Canaanites, a people whose quiet civilization thrived across the Levant. They built simple, rough-hewn stone houses, their lives revolving around the seasonal rhythms of farming and the constant need to guard their precious water source. In the cool darkness of the hillside, they began to carve channels and cisterns, a quiet, monumental effort to protect the spring from enemies during times of siege. The name given to this settlement, long before the Hebrew language was formalized, appears in the ancient Egyptian execration texts and the famous Amarna letters. It was called something like Rusalimum, or Urus, a name often interpreted to mean foundation of the god Shalom, a quiet acknowledgement of its sacred nature even in these earliest days. Shalom was the Canaanite god of dusk and the setting sun, a peaceful deity whose name echoes the very word for peace. It is a profound, quiet irony that a city named for peace would become the most contested place on earth. Feel the deep encompassing silence of that first dawn. Hear only the soft sound of the flowing Gihon, the gentle wind rustling the dry grasses, and the muffled rhythm of hammers striking stone as the first, crude walls were raised. These walls were a desperate, quiet declaration of presence, defining the boundary between the fragile safety within and the vast, uncertain world outside. We imagine the leaders of Jerusalem, petty kings in service to the mighty pharaohs of Egypt, writing their quiet, desperate appeals on clay tablets, the famous Amarna letters, begging their Egyptian overlords for assistance against invading tribal forces. The city was a small, vital speck of civilization clinging to a rock. Its early history, a quiet testament to the sheer, stubborn will of human communities to survive in a difficult place. Let your mind drift now over the sheer passage of this immense time, from the first quiet settlement to the emergence of the great Israelite kingdom. Nearly 3 millennia of history unfolded in the gentle, constant pace of the changing seasons above that single, flowing spring. The history of Jerusalem begins here, on this high, sun-drenched hill, rooted in the essential need for water, foreshadowed by a name that whispered of peace. The quiet, ancient Canaanite history of Jerusalem was dramatically, decisively broken around 1,000 years before the Common Era by a man whose name would forever be synonymous with the city, King David. David was the unifying king of the emerging Israelite tribes, and he sought a capital city for his new, united kingdom. His choice was deliberate and profoundly strategic. Jerusalem, or the small Jebusite fortress it had become, was located precisely on the boundary between the northern tribes and the southern tribes, a neutral territory that belonged to no single faction. Furthermore, its natural defenses were formidable. The city clung tightly to its hill, surrounded by deep, protective valleys. Imagine David's forces, in a swift, quiet, and decisive action, breaching the city's defenses, perhaps through a surprise attack channeled through the Gihon water system itself. The Jebusite hold was broken, and the city was renamed the City of David, the birthplace of the Israelite monarchy. This quiet conquest was not just a political act. It was a profound, spiritual transformation. David did not simply make Jerusalem a political capital. He sought to make it the spiritual center of his entire kingdom. To achieve this, he orchestrated the quiet, sacred transfer of the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, from its temporary resting place to his newly captured city. This solemn, slow procession, accompanied by music and reverence, was the symbolic act that designated Jerusalem as the holiest city, the quiet, chosen dwelling place of the divine presence. David then looked upon the high, commanding plateau directly north of his small city ridge, a place known as Mount Moriah, or the Temple Mount. Jewish tradition held that this was the very spot where Abraham had been commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac, a location already sacred as a place of profound obedience and covenant. David secured this site, purchasing a threshing floor from a Jebusite named Aram, with the intention of building a permanent, magnificent house for God. Though David was not permitted to build the temple himself, the quiet, monumental task was reserved for his son, Solomon. Imagine the great, collaborative energy across the land as vast quantities of Lebanese cedar, fine stone, and precious metals were gathered for this unparalleled construction. Solomon's temple, completed around 957 BCE, was not merely a house of worship. It was the national, political, and spiritual heart of the United Kingdom of Israel, a glorious, quiet declaration of power and devotion. The temple held the Ark of the Covenant in its innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, a space so sacred that it could only be entered by the high priest, and only on the Day of Atonement. The city, now crowned by this magnificent structure, became a focal point for a pilgrimage, a place where the entire nation would quietly ascend to worship and celebrate the great festivals. The sound of the First Temple period was the quiet, rhythmic ritual of sacrifice, the chanting of the priests, and the soft, collective prayers of the gathered pilgrims. This act of building established Jerusalem not just as a capital, but as the eternal, quiet center of the Jewish world, a spiritual focus that would survive every destruction, every exile, and every political upheaval that the next 3,000 years would bring. The glory of the First Temple period, a time of quiet national and spiritual unity, was tragically short. Following the reign of Solomon, the kingdom fractured, and Jerusalem remained the capital only of the smaller, southern kingdom of Judah. For the next 3 centuries, Jerusalem became a quiet island of independence, constantly maneuvering between the colossal powers of Assyria and Babylon. The city's history in this era is a long, slow narrative of siege, tribute, and the persistent, quiet warnings of the great prophets, who lamented the moral decay within the sacred walls. In 586 BCE, the inevitable and catastrophic force arrived. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by the fearsome King Nebuchadnezzar II, besieged Jerusalem after years of simmering revolt. The final, brutal siege was a period of starvation and profound, desperate quiet. The city finally fell, and the destruction that followed was total and devastating. Imagine the acrid smoke rising from the burning timber, the loud crash of the massive stones, and the profound, terrible quiet that descended upon the city. Once the violence was done, the First Temple, the quiet, glorious work of Solomon, was utterly leveled, reduced to smoking rubble. This act of destruction was the first great, profound silence in the heart of the city's spiritual life. Following the destruction, the Babylonian army enacted the first great exile. The leading citizens, the priests, the skilled craftsmen, and the royal family were forcibly marched in a long, sorrowful, quiet procession to Babylon, leaving Jerusalem a desolate ruin, largely empty of its inhabitants. This exile profoundly reshaped Jewish identity. Without the temple, the physical center of their faith, the people were forced to redefine their worship, shifting their focus from ritual sacrifice to prayer, study, and the quiet remembrance of the lost city. This era gave birth to the synagogue and the deep, enduring yearning for return, the foundational hope that permeates Jewish thought. The exile, however, did not last. 50 years later, a quiet, seismic shift occurred in the geopolitical landscape. Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and, in 539 BCE, issued his famous edict, permitting the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and, crucially, to rebuild their temple. This return, led by figures like Zerubbabel and later Ezra and Nehemiah, was a quiet, profound act of national resurrection. They did not return to a golden city, but to a heap of ruins. The rebuilding of the city walls and the establishment of the Second Temple, completed in 515 BCE, was a long, arduous, and often frustrating process. The new temple was modest, lacking the opulence, and, most significantly, the sacred Ark of the Covenant, which had been lost in the destruction of the first. Yet, its very existence was a quiet, powerful testament to the unbreakable spiritual bond between the people and their city. This period, known as the Second Temple period, was a time of quiet devotion, of struggling against internal division and external domination, a long, subtle preparation for the profound historical events yet to unfold upon this resilient, quiet hill. The period of the Second Temple, beginning with the quiet restoration under the Persians, soon entered a new era of turbulence with the arrival of the Greek world. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great swept through the Levant, and Jerusalem quietly opened its gates, avoiding destruction but entering the vast, encompassing world of Hellenistic culture. For a time, under the rule of the Egyptian-based Ptolemies, Jerusalem maintained a degree of quiet autonomy, practicing its ancient religion behind the strong walls of tradition. However, this period of quiet coexistence was shattered when control of the region passed to the Seleucid Empire. Based in Syria, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes was determined to forcefully Hellenize his empire, a cultural assimilation that struck at the very heart of Jewish practice. In 168 BCE, the subtle pressure turned into profound, shocking violence. Antiochus desecrated the Holy Temple, dedicating it to the Greek god Zeus, and forbidding Jewish practices like circumcision and Sabbath observance. This desecration was a spiritual shock that was violently rejected. Imagine the sudden, horrifying silence that fell over the Temple Mount, the quiet terror of the priests, and the profound, collective gasp of the populace, as their most sacred space was polluted. This act sparked the Maccabean revolt, led by the priest Mattathias and his sons, particularly Judah Maccabee. A small, quiet rebellion began in the hillsides, fueled by religious devotion and a fierce commitment to Jewish law. This was a long, hard-fought struggle, not an open battle against a massive army, but a campaign of quiet, determined guerrilla warfare against a powerful empire. Against all odds, the Maccabees were victorious. In 164 BCE, Judah Maccabee recaptured Jerusalem and purified the desecrated temple, a joyous, fervent, quiet ritual of rededication. This event is commemorated by the annual festival of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. A quiet celebration of a miracle of resilience. The victory led to a brief, glorious period of independent Jewish sovereignty under the Hasmonean dynasty. A period of quiet, national pride not seen since the days of Solomon. The city flourished, its population grew, and the Temple Mount was once again the vibrant center of Jewish life. But the Hasmonean rule was eventually plagued by internal strife, political intrigue, and a quiet, slow descent into corruption, mirroring the human frailties that eventually undermine all kingdoms. The internal divisions provided the perfect, quiet opening for the next colossal power to arrive. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey the Great arrived in the Levant. Invited by rival Hasmonean factions to arbitrate their dispute, Pompey quietly decided to seize the city for Rome. He besieged Jerusalem and, in a shocking violation of the temple's sanctity, his soldiers entered the Holy of Holies. The sight of Roman soldiers walking through the most sacred space on earth sent a powerful, unsettling message. Jerusalem was no longer a fully sovereign power. It was a client state, and the quiet autonomy of the Hasmonean fire was extinguished beneath the heavy, solid, and enduring shadow of Rome. The city would now enter its longest and most transformative era, a time of both profound splendor and unparalleled catastrophe. With the quiet, decisive arrival of Pompey in 63 BCE, Jerusalem passed into the long, powerful shadow of the Roman Republic, and later, the Empire. The next century would be a period of immense change, culminating in the greatest destruction the city had yet known. The transition was defined by the powerful, ambitious, and deeply paranoid figure of Herod the Great. Appointed king of Judea by the Roman Senate in 40 BCE, Herod was a man of colossal architectural ambition and a master of political survival. He understood the two rule. He needed to placate Rome while simultaneously owing and controlling his Jewish subjects. His vision for Jerusalem was one of unparalleled splendor, transforming the ancient city into a true jewel of the Roman East. His most spectacular achievement was the massive, revolutionary rebuilding and expansion of the Second Temple. He expanded the Temple Mount platform itself to an immense size, using colossal retaining walls, a truly staggering feat of engineering. The Western Wall, which stands to this day, is a surviving portion of this very retaining wall, a quiet, powerful testament to the scale of Herod's project. The temple itself was faced with white stone, its gold plating so brilliant that according to ancient accounts, it shone with a blinding flash in the sunlight. Imagine the quiet awe of the pilgrims as they approached this gleaming edifice, the rhythmic sound of masons and builders echoing across the city for decades as the monumental work continued. Alongside the temple, Herod built massive secular structures. The mighty Antonia Fortress, a Roman military compound overlooking the Temple Mount, and his own luxurious, heavily fortified palace, complete with 3 colossal towers named after his family. The city became a bustling, vibrant, and crowded metropolis, a fusion of Hellenistic architecture and Jewish tradition, its streets alive with pilgrims, merchants, and Roman soldiers. The air was thick with the quiet tension between the Jewish desire for sovereignty and the ever-present, heavy military power of the Roman procurators who governed the province. This tension defined the next decades, a slow, quiet accumulation of resentment against Roman taxes, Roman authority, and the constant, subtle infringement upon Jewish religious law. This era was also the quiet, foundational time for the next great religious revolution to emerge from the city. Sometime around 30 CE, a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth arrived in Jerusalem, ministered, and was, according to the New Testament accounts, crucified just outside the city walls under the authority of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. His death, burial, and resurrection, which Christian tradition places squarely within the confines of Jerusalem, would later transform the city into the holiest place on earth for an entirely new, nascent faith. The religious, political, and cultural forces were quietly reaching a breaking point. The immense splendor of Herod's city masked a deeply divided and volatile society. The quiet murmur of discontent grew into a loud, unified roar, setting the stage for the final, devastating confrontation with the Roman Empire, a conflict that would change the history of Jerusalem forever. The quiet, simmering resentment that had been building beneath the surface of Herod's splendid city finally erupted into open, catastrophic conflict in 66 CE. This event, known as the Great Jewish Revolt, was an uprising against the deeply resented and often corrupt Roman The Jewish rebels, composed of various factions, including the fiercely zealous Sicarii, initially managed to push the Roman garrison out of Jerusalem, establishing a brief, exhilarating period of independent rule. But this independence was fleeting and ultimately fatal. Emperor Nero dispatched a massive, overwhelming Roman army, first under the command of Vespasian, and later under his son, Titus. The Roman legions slowly, methodically reconquered the rebellious territories, tightening the siege noose around Jerusalem itself. The siege of Jerusalem, which lasted for nearly 5 months in the year 70 CE, was a period of profound, unimaginable, or inside the thick, high walls of the city. The population endured starvation, disease, and, tragically, vicious infighting among the various Jewish factions, which often inflicted more damage upon themselves than the Romans did. Imagine the quiet despair of the starving citizens, the sound of the Roman battering rams constantly pounding the massive walls, and the terrible, constant sound of conflict. Titus's army finally breached the walls, and the fighting descended into a brutal, house-to-house struggle. The city was systematically leveled, and in a moment of history there remains a point of profound, eternal mourning. The Second Temple was set ablaze and utterly destroyed. The enormous, brilliant structure that Herod had built was reduced to a smoking ruin, stone by stone, just as the prophets had foretold. The gold of the temple, melted by the intense heat, ran between the cracks of the stones, prompting Roman soldiers to pry apart every block in their desperate search for treasure. This destruction of the temple was not merely a military victory. It was an act of profound, calculated psychological warfare intended to break the spiritual and national will of the Jewish people. With the temple gone, the ritualistic heart of Judaism was destroyed. The destruction was near total. The entire city, outside of a few towers left standing as a monument to Roman might, was erased from the landscape. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, enslaved, or dispersed. The physical city of Jerusalem ceased to exist. The trauma of 70 CE cemented the pattern of exile and became the central, defining tragedy of Jewish history for the next 2 millennia. The only major surviving remnant of Herod's Temple Mount complex was a section of the massive western retaining wall which became the emotional and spiritual focus of the surviving community, the site of the quiet, enduring lament for what was lost. A few decades later, the last flicker of Jewish sovereignty was violently extinguished after the Bar Kokhba revolt 132, 135. Upon crushing this final rebellion, Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the entire city, renaming it Aelia, a Roman colony dedicated to the pagan god Jupiter, and he explicitly banned all Jews from entering the city, transforming the physical space into a definitive statement of Roman dominance and Christian beginnings. Jerusalem was officially scrubbed of its Jewish identity, entering a long, quiet, desolate period under the heavy hand of Roman colonial rule. The profound silence that followed the Bar Kokhba revolt settled over the newly named Roman colony of Aelia. The city that Hadrian had rebuilt was unrecognizable to those who remembered the Herodian splendor. It was a standardized Roman town, complete with a main north-south street, the Cardo Maximus, temples dedicated to Roman deities, and, crucially, a complete absence of the Jewish presence. The physical space was cleansed of its past, but the spiritual significance of the site was merely transformed, not diminished. This period of quiet Romanized existence saw the slow, quiet rise of a new spiritual identity for the city, its emergence as the undisputed center of Christian pilgrimage for the small, nascent Christian community, which was largely Gentile following the Jewish expulsions. Aelia Capitolina held the most sacred sites of their new faith, the places of Jesus, passion, death, and resurrection. Initially, the sites were marked only by tradition, often obscured by Roman temples placed there deliberately to suppress the memory of the Jewish and Christian past. This all changed dramatically in the 4th century CE. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire, and by the end of the century, it was the state religion. This transformation had a revolutionary impact on Jerusalem. Helena, Constantine's mother, made a profound, quiet pilgrimage to the city, an act of faith that unlocked immense imperial resources. She is credited with locating the site of the crucifixion and resurrection. This quiet, deeply significant discovery led to the construction of the most monumental and sacred Christian building in the world, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Imagine the scene. Roman pagan temples are cleared away, and a massive, complex, and beautiful structure rises, encompassing both the traditional site of Calvary and the tomb believed to be that of Jesus. The building was a powerful, quiet declaration of the city's new, dominant, religious identity. The city walls were rebuilt, the Cardo was extended, and Jerusalem was filled with churches, monasteries, and hospices, all designed to accommodate the ever-increasing flow of Christian pilgrims who poured in from across the vast expanse of the Byzantine Empire. The quiet, desolate Aelia Capitolina was reborn as a vibrant, glittering Christian holy city. The sounds of this era were the quiet chanting of monks, the gentle rustle of pilgrims' robes, and the constant, soft ring of hammers as new churches and chapels were constructed. This long, slow period of Byzantine dominance was one of relative stability and peace, punctuated by brief moments of external threat, such as the Persian invasion in 614 CE, which caused immense destruction before the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius recaptured the city a few years later. Though the Jewish ban was never entirely lifted, small Jewish communities were allowed to quietly return and settle in certain quarters of the city. The primary identity of Jerusalem was, for 4 centuries, undeniably Christian. its streets tracing the quiet path of the Via Dolorosa and its skyline, dominated by the domes and spires of Christian veneration. But history is a constant cycle of change, and the stability of the Byzantine era was slowly, quietly, but inevitably drawing to a close, preparing the city for the next great spiritual transformation. The quiet, Christian-dominated period of Byzantine rule was brought to a decisive, yet remarkably peaceful, close in 638 CE, with the arrival of the Islamic armies. 6 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Jerusalem was besieged by the forces of the Rashidun. The city's Byzantine governor, patriarchs, recognized the futility of resistance and, according to historical accounts, quietly surrendered the city on the condition that the Caliph himself, Umar ibn al-Khattab, would come to accept the surrender personally. Caliph Umar's arrival in Jerusalem was a moment of profound, quiet, religious tolerance. He entered the city in humble attire and immediately demonstrated a deep respect for the existing Christian holy sites. The most famous account describes Umar refusing to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, fearing that if he did, future Muslims would turn the church into a mosque, thereby depriving the Christians of their most sacred site. Instead, he prayed quietly on a spot a short distance away. This quiet act of reverence set a crucial precedent for Islamic rule in Jerusalem, establishing a tradition of protection for the Christian and Jewish communities as people of the book. This new era quickly established Jerusalem as a central, third holy city in the emerging faith of Islam, known as Al-Quds, or the Holy. The city's holiness for Muslims derived from its status as the first Qibla, the initial direction of prayer, and, most profoundly, as the location of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension, Al-Isir Wami Erihota, an event where he was said to have miraculously traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem and ascended to heaven from the sacred rock. The site of this ascension was the Temple Mount, the desolate, revered plateau that had been left largely undeveloped and ruined since the destruction of the Second Temple. The Caliph Umar reportedly cleared the site of Rubel. The true architectural transformation of the Temple Mount, however, occurred under the Umayyad Caliphate. Later in the 7th century, Caliph Abd al-Malik commissioned the construction of the magnificent Dome of the Rock. Completed in 691 CE, this architectural masterpiece, with its glowing golden dome and intricate mosaics, was built directly over the sacred rock. It was not a mosque, but a beautiful, quiet shrine built to enclose and revere the ascension point, and to stand as a powerful, peaceful symbol of Islam's presence and claim. Shortly afterward, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, meaning the farthest mosque, was constructed on the southern end of the platform, becoming one of the most important places of worship in Islam. Imagine the quiet, powerful visual impact of the Golden Dome, rising above the city, a new and permanent marker of spiritual sovereignty. Under the early Islamic caliphates, Jerusalem experienced a golden age of intellectual and religious quietude. The city, while no longer a capital, was immensely revered. Jewish communities were once again permitted to live, worship, and grow within the city walls, contributing to the rich, multi-faith tapestry that defined this quiet, tolerant era. This peace and stability, however, like all periods in Jerusalem's long history, would eventually give way to the rising turbulence of foreign incursions and political change. The quiet stability of the early Islamic period was violently shattered at the close of the 11th century by a colossal military movement from the West. The Crusades, driven by religious fervor and the desire to reclaim the birthplace of Christianity from Muslim control, European armies embarked on a massive, relentless journey toward the Holy Land. In the summer of 1099 CE, the armies of the First Crusade arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. The resulting siege and capture of the city were brutal and catastrophic. Following a short, desperate siege, the Crusaders breached the walls and, in an act of terrible violence that remains a dark stain on history, massacred a substantial portion of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The city was taken not with the quiet tolerance of Caliph Umar, but with the loud, terrifying ferocity of religious war. Jerusalem was transformed once again, becoming the capital of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Christian rule was imposed, and the city's Islamic and Jewish landmarks were repurposed or suppressed, The Dome of the Rock was converted into a church called the Templum Domini, Temple of the Lord, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque became the royal palace. Churches and monasteries were restored and built in the European style, attracting a new wave of Western Christian pilgrims. The sound of Jerusalem shifted dramatically, moving from the quiet call to prayer and the chanting of Eastern monks to the heavy clang of Crusader armor in the solemn Gregorian chant of the Latin Church. This period of Crusader rule lasted for nearly a century, a time of constant, quiet, military tension, punctuated by periodic sieges and battles. The Christian kingdom was an isolated, heavily fortified island in a vast Muslim sea, constantly struggling for survival. The balance of power was decisively shifted once again by the emergence of one of history's most revered figures, Saladin. The Kurdish general and Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin was the quiet, determined unifying force that brought the Islamic world together against the Crusader presence. Following his decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin marched on Jerusalem, commencing a siege in 1187 CE. The siege was short. Unlike the Crusaders' bloody entry, Saladin chose the path of quiet diplomacy and tolerance. The city surrendered, and Saladin allowed the Christian inhabitants to leave peacefully, ransoming many and preventing the massacre that had defined the Crusader conquest. This quiet, merciful act earned him profound respect, even among his enemies. With the recapture of Jerusalem, the city returned to Muslim rule. Saladin immediately undertook the work of reversing the Crusader modifications. The Dome of the Rock was purified and restored as an Islamic shrine, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was rededicated for Muslim prayer. Crucially, Saladin welcomed the return of the Jewish community, encouraging them to resettle and re-establish their quiet presence in the city. The memory of the Crusades, however, left an indelible mark on Jerusalem, shattering the previous model of multi-faith coexistence and establishing a new dangerous precedent for religious warfare over the sacred site, a precedent that would quietly endure in the psyche of the three faiths for centuries. The quiet of the Ayyubid period under Saladin's successors was a period of repair and restoration, a gentle reassertion of Islamic authority after the profound shock of the European intrusion. The Crusader era was followed by the long, quiet stability of two successive Islamic dynasties, the Ayyubids, the heirs of Saladin, and later the Mamluks, who ruled from Egypt. This period, lasting from 1250 CE until 1517 CE, saw Jerusalem settle into a new role. No longer an imperial capital, but an immensely important, quiet provincial city of profound spiritual reverence. Under the Mamluks, Jerusalem was transformed into a center of Islamic scholarship and religious devotion. The Mamluk sultans poured enormous resources into the city, not into military fortifications, but into building schools, hospices, and mosques. The old city was adorned with magnificent, quiet examples of Mamluk architecture, including elegant fountains, madrasas religious schools, and khanzins for pilgrims. These structures were often built around the perimeter of the Temple Mount, cementing its identity as a Muslim holy site. And the sound of the city was characterized by the quiet, rhythmic chanting of students and the rustle of scholars' robes. The Mamluk period was one of continued Christian and Jewish presence, albeit under the protective but restrictive umbrella of Islamic authority. Jewish communities, strengthened by the arrival of influential rabbis and scholars, quietly thrived, rebuilding their synagogues and continuing their ancient traditions. Christian pilgrims, despite periodic restrictions and periods of tension, continued to visit the sacred sites under the negotiated protection of various European and monastic orders, particularly the Franciscans, who formally became the custodians of the Holy Land. Yet, this quiet resilience was periodically broken by conflict and natural disaster. The city walls were often destroyed and rebuilt based on the shifting strategic needs of the Egyptians, creating a cycle of quiet construction and destruction that marked the passage of time. The infamous Black Death also swept through the city in the 14th century, bringing a period of profound, terrible silence and loss. 2. 3. Lasting peace for the city arrived with the conquest of the Levant by the Ottoman Empire in 1517 CE. The Ottoman Sultan, Selim, took the city without a fight, ushering in the longest period of continuous, quiet stability the city had known since the early Byzantine era. This long period of Ottoman rule, which lasted exactly 400 years, was characterized by imperial order and a remarkable degree of religious tolerance and administrative structure. The defining architectural legacy of the Ottoman era belongs to Suleiman the Magnificent. In the 1530s, he commissioned the complete rebuilding of the walls that still encircle the old city today, a magnificent, quiet act of protection that finally secured Jerusalem's boundaries and image. Imagine the slow, meticulous process of stone laying, the rhythmic sound of masons, and the quiet pride of the citizens as their city was encased in the strong, beautiful, protective stone that defines its image today. The city settled into a quiet, provincial rhythm, becoming a peaceful, if somewhat sleepy, backwater of a vast empire. Life within the walls followed the rhythm of the three faiths, each quietly observing its own ancient ceremonies, creating a unique, enduring, and peaceful multi-faith sound. This long, 4-century silence of Ottoman rule allowed the city to quietly preserve its past, a final act of stability before the world outside erupted with the profound, dramatic forces of modernity. For 400 years, the Ottoman Empire maintained a long, quiet stability in Jerusalem, preserving its ancient, multi-faith character. But the 20th century arrived with a roar, and that peace was irrevocably shattered. The First World War signaled the end of the Ottoman era. In December 1917, a new power arrived. British forces, led by General Edmund Allenby, entered the Holy City. This moment marked a quiet, yet monumental, shift of power from the Islamic East to the Christian West. In a now famous gesture of respect for Jerusalem's sacred status, Allenby dismounted his horse and entered the ancient Jaffa Gate on foot. The war was over, but a new chapter of governance was just beginning. Control of Jerusalem was officially placed under the British Mandate, a period of British administrative rule authorized by the League of Nations. This era, stretching from 1917 to 1948, was meant to be a time of orderly transition, but instead, it became the crucible where ancient conflicts were reborn in a modern form within the ancient stone confines of Jerusalem. Too powerful, competing national aspirations began to take solid shape and inevitably clash. On one side was the burgeoning movement of political Zionism, which sought to establish a national home for the Jewish people in their ancestral land. On the other was the rising tide of Palestinian Arab nationalism, a movement determined to secure self-determination for the indigenous Arab population who had lived there for centuries. The British, the new administrators, found themselves caught in the middle, struggling to mediate between these two passionate, irreconcilable claims to the same small, sacred piece of land. The city itself began to change physically. For centuries, its life was contained within the massive Ottoman walls. Now, Jerusalem began to expand rapidly outwards. New Jewish and Arab neighborhoods began to spring up, creating a segregated but quickly growing metropolis. The soundscape of the city also transformed. The quiet hum of daily life and the chants of prayer were increasingly punctuated by a new, unsettling sound. The noise of political organizing, public demonstrations, and, with growing frequency, the eruption of violence. The decades of the British Mandate were marked by a slow, simmering escalation of communal tension. This wasn't a constant war, but a series of riots and small-scale conflicts that would flare up over disputes involving land, economic control, and, most potently, access to the holy sites. The Western Wall, the last surviving remnant of the Second Temple and a hallowed site of Jewish prayer, became a particularly intense focal point. Here, deep religious devotion dangerously overlapped with nationalistic claims. The simmering tensions boiled over into tragic and violent riots. In 1929, a grim foreshadowing of the deepening divide, the British, tasked with keeping the peace, grew increasingly overwhelmed. They were caught in a web of ancient, sacred claims and modern political ambitions they simply could not reconcile. The two national movements were on a collision course, and Britain could not find a path to a peaceful resolution. Finally, feeling the problem was unsolvable, they decided to hand it over to the international community. They surrendered the mandate to the newly formed United Nations, hoping a global body could succeed where they had failed. In 1947, the United Nations took up the challenge and passed Resolution 181, a document that would become famously known as the Partition Plan. The plan proposed a radical solution to divide the territory of Mandatory Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. But what about Jerusalem? Given its unique and intensely contested sacred status, the UN proposed a special designation. Jerusalem was to become a corpus separatum, a separate entity, a city under international control, belonging to neither side but open to all. This vision of a peacefully internationalized city, however, was never realized. The plan was accepted by Jewish leaders, but rejected by Arab leaders and nations. When the British officially withdrew their forces in May 1948, the conflict that had been simmering for decades erupted into a full-scale war. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War would decide the fate of the city not by diplomacy, but by force. When the fighting finally subsided, an armistice was signed, and a line was drawn on a map with a green pencil. This green line cut straight through the heart of Jerusalem, physically and painfully dividing it. The result of the war was a city split in two. West Jerusalem came under the control of the new state of Israel. East Jerusalem, which crucially included the Old City and its most sacred sites, the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, fell under the control of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Walls and barbed wire now sliced through neighborhoods, separating communities and families. The ancient, unified city was gone. A profound and tragic silence fell upon the divided Jerusalem. It was the quiet of separation, where Jews were cut off from the Western Wall, and Arabs in the West were cut off from their homes and relatives in the East. This unnatural silence, the quiet of a community torn apart, would hang over the city for nearly 2 decades, a painful pause in its long and tumultuous history. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a critical period in Jerusalem's history. It's a complex story, and understanding these past events is key to understanding the city today. If you found this video informative, please give it a like. And do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do miss our next exploration into the world's most fascinating histories. See you next time. The quiet division of Jerusalem between Israel and Jordan, formalized in 1949, was a period of unnatural, enforced separation that lasted for 19 years. For the Israeli population of West Jerusalem, the most sacred sites of Judaism, the Western Wall, and the ancient cemeteries on the Mount of Olives were inaccessible, a source of constant, quiet pain and longing. East Jerusalem and the Old City, under Jordanian rule, saw a decline in its Jewish population, and the Jewish quarter within the walls fell largely into ruin. The Jordanian period saw the quiet preservation of the Muslim and Christian holy sites, but the fundamental, shared spirit of the city was fractured. The quiet division was dramatically, decisively broken in June 1967. During the Six-Day War, Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem and the Old City. The moment when the Israeli paratroopers reached the Western Wall was one of intense, quiet emotion, immediately followed by the loud, dramatic political action of reunification. Israel immediately declared the city unified and extended its law and administration over the entire municipal area, a move that was later declared an annexation by the international community. The quiet reunification brought all the city's holy sites back under a single administrative umbrella, but it did not resolve the fundamental, deep-seated conflict over ownership and sovereignty. Israel established the status quo arrangement for the Temple Mount Haram al-Sir, granting administrative control of the Muslim holy sites to the Jerusalem Islamic Waqfa, a Jordanian religious trust, while maintaining overall security control. This complex, often precarious arrangement has been the source of continuous, quiet, and sometimes violent tension ever since. The modern city is defined by this quiet, continuous contestation. It is a modern, bustling metropolis, with thriving business, cultural, and political life in its western half, and an ancient, vibrant, and complex old city in eastern half, with residents fiercely divided over the city's political future. For Jews, Jerusalem is the eternal, unified capital of Israel, the spiritual heart of their people for 3,000 years. For Palestinians, it is Al-Quds, the historical and future capital of their desired independent state. For Christians across the globe, it remains the quiet, sacred site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the story of the Christ. The history of Jerusalem is therefore not a finished story. It is a long, slow, and continuous narrative of destruction and rebuilding, of conquest and return, a story constantly being written in the quiet tension of its streets. As we conclude our long journey, listen not just to the sounds of its history, but to the quiet, perpetual sound of the wind that flows through the ancient valleys over the stones of the western wall and around the golden dome of the rock. It is the sound of an eternal city, a place where the claims of religion, nation, and history converge in a deep, profound, and unending echo. Let the quiet rhythm of its 3 millennia of existence lull you now to a peaceful, contemplative rest, as the quiet city of peace awaits its next inevitable dawn.